Dark Knight, world's greatest detective, Caped Crusader, whatever you call him. Batman, through his comics, TV shows, and movies, has had an undeniable impact on pop culture. But throughout his over 80-year history, it is obvious that Batman has evolved. Because like any piece of culture, Batman grows and changes to fit the times. The Batman we are familiar with is a far cry from the character developed all those years ago. Ironically, the creation of Batman was born out of the success of a character that he's often compared to, Superman. After the resounding success of Superman, National Comics publications, later renamed DC Comics, would be looking for new superheroes to give the public. So editor Vin Sullivan reached out to comedy cartoonist Bob Kane to create a new hero, taking inspiration from a variety of sources, including Dick Tracy, Superman, Zorro, the Phantom, and Da Vinci's Ornithopter, developed Batman. He would then bring his Batman to friend and writer Milton Bill. Seeing too many similarities to Superman, Bill would suggest replacing the wings with a cape, the domino mask with a bat-eared cowl, changing the suit's color to gray, adding gloves and white pupilless eyes. Alone, Bob Kane would present this character to National Comics publications, who agreed to publish it. In his contract, Kane would negotiate a byline for himself as the creator, artist, and writer of Batman, as well as a percentage of the profits of anything Batman was licensed on. This gave Bill Finger the position of ghostwriter, a writer whose works are credited to another. The question of Batman's creation remains controversial. While Bob Kane had the original idea, the concepts that Bill Finger provided to the character are core tenets of Batman's identity and mythos. Beyond the costume, Bill created the tone of the book, drawing on Sherlock Holmes and mystery noir serials of the time, Gotham City, Batman's personality, the Batcave, Batmobile, Batman's origin, and his alter ego Bruce Wayne by combining Bruce from Robert the Bruce, a Scottish king, and Mad Anthony Wayne, a U.S. soldier during the Revolution. Finger would co-create the Joker, the Scarecrow, the Riddler, the Penguin, Robin, Catwoman, and Commissioner Gordon. But because of Bob Kane's contract, Bill Finger would receive no credit or compensation beyond his basic salary. Because of Batman's age, the argument of what percent of the character each member of the duo is responsible for is up to debate. It's a he said, she said situation. But it is hard to argue that Bill Finger wasn't cheated out of some level of credit for the Batman and his mythos. Viewing in Detective Comics issue 27, March 1939, in the case of the Chemical Syndicate, Batman would be introduced to the public. This would also mark the first appearance of Commissioner Gordon. Batman would be an overnight sensation. It was a noir mystery, a very dark tone, and elements of horror showcased by Batman's moral code or lack thereof, with Batman willing to let criminals die and using a gun. The style would characterize early Batman stories, but quickly, signature features such as his origin of watching his parents die in front of him and dedicating his life to fighting criminals everywhere, batarangs, and vehicles would be introduced. With the success of Batman, he would develop a larger team of ghostwriters, artists, and inkers to work on the book. Finger would suggest a sidekick to Batman, giving him someone to talk to instead of simply showing his thoughts, a Watson to Batman's Sherlock Holmes. Furthermore, the addition of a kid sidekick could draw in young readers by giving them an audience surrogate. Inker Robinson would suggest the name Robin because he was reading Robin Hood at the time. Robinson would base Robin's costume off of the illustrations of N.C. Wyeth, drawing them from memory. Both Bob Kane and publisher Jack Leibowitz would be against the idea. Kane preferred Batman working alone, and Leibowitz was against constantly showing a child in danger surrounded by violent criminals. But they both agreed to try out Robin for an issue and look at audience reaction. Thus, in Detective Comics issue 38, April 1940, Robin the Boy Wonder debuted. Robin's debut caused an immediate shift in tone of Batman's stories. Batman became more talkative, often explaining his actions to Robin. He would smile and crack jokes. He became less the brooding vigilante he was introduced as, more similar to the contemporary kid-friendly superheroes of the time. Robin's introduction was undoubtedly a success, with sales doubling the issue Robin was introduced. Subsequently, both Kane and Leibowitz's criticism of Robin would stop. Robin's popularity would be imitated by many other comics, giving birth to the kid sidekick trope. For this popularity, Batman would be given his own comic, featuring the adventures of Batman and Robin the Boy Wonder as the dynamic duo. Batman #1, April 1940, would introduce important elements to Batman, including the creation of two of his most iconic foes, that being the Joker, who was inspired by a Joker playing card and designed after actor Conroy Beats when playing in the 1928 movie The Man Who Laughs, and Catwoman, who was simply introduced as the Cat, as a character who could draw on female leaders, have sex appeal, and, I quote, be a friendly foe who committed crimes but was also a romantic interest in Batman's rather sterile life. Bob Kane, 1989. Batman #1 would also lead to the creation of Batman's no gun, no killing rule. This rule would be set up by editor Whitney Ellsworth in response to a set of panels in Batman #1. Batman shot down one of Hugo Strange's monster men with a machine gun. Ellsworth, knowing the audience of Batman was largely children, wanted to turn Batman into a role model who was less violent. Batman #1 was a success, and Kane expanded his studio to deal with the heavier workload. The following issues would establish the Batmobile, the Batcave, Bat-Signal, and Gotham City, officially ending Batman's tenure as the protector of Manhattan. On December 11, 1941, the U.S. would officially join the Allies in World War II, and of course, as a dedicated American hero, Batman would actively take part in propaganda by encouraging buying war bonds, fighting Nazis, Japanese, and U.S. traders. Propaganda would also mark the first interaction between Batman and Superman, with them being featured on the world's finest comic covers, although they never met in the stories. It was simply to show that World's Finest contained both a Superman and Batman story. Another important step was the rename of National Comics to DC Comics, with DC being the initials for one of their best-selling series, Detective Comics. The comic industry would boom during World War II. This was due to the escapism the medium provided at a cheap cost. It is notable that many soldiers would be shipped out with comics for entertainment. Batman's canon would further expand with the introduction of classic villains, such as Scarecrow, who drew on the horror elements Batman had lost, the Penguin, who was, albeit silly, a refined criminal genius, the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde-inspired Two-Face, the zombie Solomon Grundy, the mind-manipulating Mad Hatter, and the King of Questions, the Riddler, as well as allies like Alfred Beagle, the dedicated butler, whose last name was swiftly changed to Pennyworth, and whose appearance changed to fit the 1943 Batman theatrical serial. The intrepid reporter and love interest Vicky Vale, the JSA, of which Batman was an honorary part-time member of, and the quickly forgotten Boy Commandos. In this era, Joker would become more a prankster than the psychopath killer he was introduced as. Batman would enter new mediums, with Batman being the guest character on the 1940s Superman radio show, the 1943 Batman theatrical serial, sequel, the 1949 Batman and Robin theatrical serial, and the Batman newspaper comic strip. This period would be a period of expansive growth for Batman, but the Golden Age was ending, and the Silver Age would change the face of Batman as we know it. After World War II, the demand for superhero comics would begin to fall, likely because of the oversaturation of the genre, and kids showing a larger interest in science fiction, romance, western, and horror comics. As such, the only DC superheroes to survive were the most popular, those being Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. But the DC Trinity would all take a shift, embracing the more fantastical or science fiction elements of the character. It was easily implemented, with characters like Superman and Wonder Woman who already had these elements. but with Batman, it was a much more obvious tone shift. In 1952, Batman and Superman would have their first story in which they teamed up. This takes place in Superman 76. The plot centers on them fighting for the affection of Lois Lane. The success of this would turn the world's finest comic from featuring two separate Batman and Superman stories to stories featuring them together. April 19, 1954, psychiatrist Frederick Wertham would write and publish Seduction of the Innocent. Seduction of the Innocent is a scathing critique of the comics industry, addressing the inappropriate aspects of comics, specifically calling out Batman comics. Wertham would claim that Batman and Robin were supposed to subconsciously represent the ideal homosexual couple. He support this claim with a panel from Batman number 84 in which it appears that Batman and Robin are sharing a bed. This was in fact an art error, as the headboards clearly show two separate beds. It also doesn't address the fact that Robin was underage, which one should probably consider a far more important detail, and it failed to acknowledge the love interest that Batman has had over the years. The outrage, sparked by Seduction of the Innocent, would lead to congressional hearings and the creation of the Comics Code Authority. The Comics Code was designed to stop any material deemed inappropriate for youth making it into comic books. DC would of course make sure that all their comics were Comics Code Authority approved. This would lead to overtly sexual, violent, or scary Batman villains, such as Catwoman, Joker, Scarecrow, and Riddler, appearing from Batman books. To address the accusations of homosexuality, the creative team would introduce Batwoman in Detective Comics number 233, July 1956. This would add to the growing Bat family, including Ace the Bat Hound, from Batman issue 92, June 1955, Commissioner Gordon, Alfred, and later Beth Kane, Batgirl, Batman, issue 139, April 1961, introduced as a love interest for Robin, and Batmite, Detective Comics, issue 267, May 1959, a reality-warping imp who was a fan of Batman. In 1956, the Silver Age would officially begin with the reintroduction of Flash, now as Barry Allen, and other heroes such as Hal Jordan as Green Lantern. Silver Age Batman stories would be characterized by their outlandish storytelling, debating covers, such as Zebra Batman, Gorilla Batman, Baby Batman, Batman, Old Batman, and Alien Batman. The villains introduced would be considered C-tier villains. The only one of great prominence would be Mr. Freeze, introduced as Mr. Zero in Batman number 121, 1959. In 1960, Batman would join the Justice League of America in Brave and the Bold number 28. But overall, Batman stories weren't selling, and the series was under the threat of termination. But DC didn't want to eliminate their second most profitable intellectual property, so instead of ending the series, they decided to assign editor Julie Schwartz. This was the editor that revitalized the Flash and Green Lantern for the Silver Age, and when assigned to Batman in 1965, he would remove many of the fantastical and wacky elements that pervaded the earlier years. This included the removal of Batwoman, Batgirl, Batmite, and Bathound, a refocus on the detective elements, and a redesign of the character made by Carmine Infante and Joe Galella. This design gave Batman his yellow oval around the bat symbol and gave him more dynamic poses. On top of this, Alfred was killed off, later resurrected. Dick Grayson's Aunt Harriet came to live with the dynamic duo, and classic villains who had been absent like Riddler and Scarecrow returned. These changes reinvigorated Batman sales, but they would skyrocket with Batman's popularity that would come from this show soon to be made. In 1966, Adam West's Batman show would premiere on ABC January 12th to critical success. It would emulate the campy styles of the comics, and therefore drew comic sales through the roof. Between 1966 and 1967, Batman comics would peak in sales, becoming the number one comic sold both years. This reflected in DC's use of Batman as a marketing tool in these years. The 1966 Batman show would reinvigorate creativity in Batman,
especially with DC pushing the Batman creative teams to create new villains that could later be used in the show. These include Poison Ivy, Clue Master, Blockbuster, and the Eraser, as well as many other D-list villains. But as the TV show's popularity waned, the TV show producers wanted to change things up and introduce a female hero. They commissioned DC to give them Batgirl. This would lead to the creation of the iconic Batgirl, whose first appearance was in Detective Comics number 359, 1967. It would also give her origin as Commissioner Gordon's daughter, Barbara Gordon. The popularity of the Adam West show would slowly wane, and with it the popularity of the show emulating comics would die too. In 1968, Bob Kane would officially leave Batman. As the early success of Batman, he was slowly taking more of a back seat. His official departure would leave more room for creative interpretations. And with Batman ending up in a run when sales running low, it would be time to reimagine The Dark Knight. The Bronze Age was born out of counterculture to the Silver Age. Everything the Silver Age wasn't, the Bronze Age was. The Bronze Age was more serious, dark, and moody. Oftentimes, creative teams would push the limits of what was allowed by the Comics Code Authority. Instead of cartoony characters, the art was focused on a level of realism. Comic stories had social commentary instead of escapism. It was an evolution of the golden age of comics, in some regards. As such, when Batman entered the Bronze Age, his status quo resembled his initial stories. The stylistic shift is spearheaded by one creative team, Neal Adams and Dennis O'Neil. While Batman was appearing in World's Finest, he would be featured more and more in Brave and the Bold. This is where Julius Schwartz would first notice the popularity of Neal Adams' Batman over the more campy Batman stories of the time. Adams' Batman was a dark, intimidating figure. He was serious, he was smart, and, possibly most importantly, he was intimidating. This was accomplished through a redesign of Batman. Adams would lengthen Batman's cape and ears, making him more resemble his Golden Age appearance. To bring Neal Adams' vision of Batman to life, in Batman 217, 1969, Robin would graduate from high school and head off to college. Batman and Alfred would leave Wayne Manor in the Batcave, moving into a penthouse in the Wayne Foundation, and Bruce Wayne would take the role as businessman, working at the Wayne Foundation during the day, on top of his responsibilities as Batman. This would establish the new status quo. Batman was without a sidekick, a lone wolf who worked as a businessman during the day, and the vigilante superhero Batman at night. To further evoke the Golden Age style, Schwartz would bring Dennis O'Neil as a writer. O'Neil would remove most of Batman's rogues gallery and focus on Batman fighting more street-level crime or creatures with supernatural elements. Creating atmosphere would again become integral to Batman's stories, as well as horror, mystery, and thriller elements. Even when it wasn't specifically O'Neil writing and Adams' art, the creative teams that would work on the books would emulate their style. But fans started to criticize the ease at which Batman would dispatch various enemies. Fans wanted the return of supervillains, characters who could push the Dark Knight to his limits and truly challenge him. The problem is that Batman's rogues gallery would be considered tainted due to their innate linkage to the 1966 Adam West show and a more campy Batman in general. Thus, DC editorial would push for the creation of new supervillains that fit the new tone of the Batman books. In Detective Comics issue 400, June 1970, Man-Bat would make his debut, and in Batman 232, June 1971, Adams and O'Neil would utilize the previously introduced League of Assassins to create Ra's al Ghul and his daughter and potential love interest for Batman, Talia al Ghul, in Detective Comics issue 411, 1971. These characters would soon become classic Batman villains. During this time, Robin and Batgirl appearances would mainly be in backup stories for the Batman comics, with Robin stories focus on balancing school and superhero responsibilities. Eventually, the lack of popularity for Batgirl would enter backup stories. In 1973, in order to keep World's Finest fresh, Bob Haney would introduce the Super Sons of Batman and Superman, Batman Jr. and Superman Jr., and their alter egos, Bruce Wayne Jr. and Clark Kent Jr. The book would later be changed back. Batman would also gain 2 TV shows, the 1973 Super Friends, and in 1977 a cartoon continuation of the Adam West 1966 show titled The New Adventures of Batman. The success of the Super Friends may have shown Schwartz that the classic Batman villains were still popular, so he allowed the creative team to bring them back. In Batman 251, September 1973, Joker would return in a story titled The Joker's Five-Way Revenge. This story would revamp the clown Prince of Crime and harken back to his Golden Age roots, only to O'Neill's and Adams' version of Batman. This changed the Joker from a campy prankster to a serial murderer whose Joker gas left victims permanently disfigured. This story would be a huge success and would lead the creative team to bringing back more classic villains like Catwoman, Penguin, and Two-Face. When Two-Face was brought back in Batman number 258, O'Neill would create a housing for Batman's captured foes called Arkham Hospital, and was quickly changed to Arkham Asylum, the iconic home for the criminally insane that Batman sends his rogues gallery to. Who is Batman? Is he the noir, gun-toting, pulp-inspired vigilante? The kid-friendly superhero? The goofy sci-fi adventurer? The world's greatest detective? The campy comic protagonist? The fear-inspiring Dark Knight? Or the protective Caped Crusader? The question of who is Batman can't be answered, because who Batman is changes to fit who we want him to be and what we need him to be. Batman's longevity comes from his adaptability. His concept of the traumatized kid seeing his parents murdered in front of him and vowing to become a being of vengeance, exacting punishment on criminals, can work in such a variety of genres that Batman can never truly die.